When I saw my husband scrolling through my phone, my heart jolted, yet not from the fear of being caught. It was because he would see those messages. The ones I forgot to delete. I reached to grab the phone from his hands, but he stepped back with the unhurried precision of a man who believes he has all the time in the world. I watched his face change line by line, the way a calm sea tightens before a storm, and I felt how my life began to buckle in a matter of seconds. Yes, he would learn the truth now. But not the whole truth. His fingers trembled as he flicked to the next screen, and I knew, any moment he would reach the message that would end everything. The single one that explained too much and not enough at the same time. Then the phone buzzed in his hands. A new notification slid over the screen. I saw the color drain from his face when he read the sender's name. He went still. He didn't even blink. I bit the inside of my cheek, the old habit that arrives with panic. My nerves braided themselves with the shame of what I had set in motion. His breathing quickened, I could hear it across the 2 meters that separated us. This was exactly what I had feared. Because 3 months ago I made a mistake, the kind of mistake that changes the oxygen in a room and the angle of every shadow. And now, I didn't know what to do, but let me tell you how it really happened. Before I share the secret I tried to keep buried for so long, write in the comments where you're watching from, and answer one question. Have you ever kept a secret with all your strength and still watched it slip through your fingers? The day he arrived, the house had that clean, post-morning smell of freshly rinsed mugs and damp dish towels. The window above the sink fogged where the kettle had sighed, and the radio murmured about weather in the mountains as if it were narrating another household, not mine. My husband left early for a meeting, promising he would be back by lunch, promising, as he often does, many small things that add up to a good life on paper. I believe him most days. The ledger of our marriage has neat columns, shared bills, a serviceable car, polite anniversaries, 2 matching wool coats hung in the hall. What the columns can't show is the blank margin where touch should be. We function, we perform, we endure. In the mornings, he kisses the air beside my cheek the way one salutes a flag, correct, brief, proud of correctness. When the doorbell rang, I wiped my hands on the dish towel and told myself to breathe like a host, not like a defendant. The man on the step, my husband's son, had the same jawline but softer eyes, the kind that pay attention. He had been a boy the last time I saw him. Time had pressed him into someone taller, quieter, more contained. He set his bag down inside with care, as if the threshold itself could bruise, and smiled without apology for arriving unannounced. I asked about the trip, the traffic, the weather. He answered with a handful of words and then a question about whether I still made the cinnamon tea he remembered. People often recall sweetness more than they recall people. I took the recollection as an awkward compliment and put the kettle back on. I am not a woman who falls in love with storms. I am practical enough to keep the pantry stocked and sentimental enough to keep the recipe cards in my mother's handwriting. I am, or thought I was, the kind of person who leaves doors closed. Yet when he carried his bag down the narrow hallway and brushed the frame with his shoulder, I noticed how small the house became around him, how the air shifted as if making space. He thanked me for clean towels as if they were a rare favor. Gratitude does strange things. It makes ordinary gestures glow. We ate lunch without the husband because meetings always take longer than men predict. The light shifted across the table and drew a line through our plates. He asked if the radio had been talking about the mountains all morning, and I nodded. He said he was thinking of driving up there while he was in town, just to clear his head. I said I had never been beyond the lookout point, even though we've lived an hour away for years. He looked at me as if that detail mattered. When he smiled, it wasn't boyish. It was measured, like someone careful with matches. There are people who speak in full paragraphs, and people who keep the verb hidden until the last moment. He belonged to the second kind. We spoke about his work in broad strokes, he sketched the outline, left me to color it in. When he asked about my days, I told him the truth that sounds like a confession: they are tidy. I run the washing machine, I write lists, I call the plumber when something drips. I teach a small class twice a week at the community center, where women my age practice balance poses and tell each other we're doing great. Sometimes, after class, I sit in the car a few extra minutes before driving home because quiet has a different temperature when nobody expects anything of you. He offered to help with dinner, and I said I had it under control. He set the table anyway, aligning the forks with an attention that felt like a compliment to the cutlery. When he reached across me for the salt, his sleeve brushed my wrist. It was nothing, that brush, but my body filed it under important. I hated the immediacy of it. I put the pot on the back burner and pretended to look for a cloth I knew was in the second drawer. My husband called at 4 to say the meeting had bloomed into a second meeting. "Don't wait up for me," he said, a phrase so familiar it lives on the key hook. I said I would keep a plate warm. I said the house was fine, that the guest room worked, that the roof didn't leak. He thanked me for managing the weather of our lives. I pressed the phone to my ear and wished he could hear the other breathing in the kitchen, the measured in and out of someone who doesn't want to make a wrong move. We ate at the small table. He told a story about getting lost on a side road when he was a teenager and how the sky had turned an impossible shade of violet. He said he learned that day that maps don't comfort, people do. I thought about the map of my marriage, full of clear routes and well-marked exits, and the uncharted places I had chosen not to visit for the sake of safety. I poured him more tea. He took the cup with 2 hands, then handed it back with one, and the difference felt like a question. After dishes, he offered to take out the trash. I refused automatically, then realized refusal was a relic from a time when I believed asking for help made me look fragile. I let him carry the bag to the bins, and I stood by the window watching the back of him move through the last wedge of daylight. The neighbor's dog barked twice and then reconsidered. The radio returned to the mountains, the snow was holding at higher elevations, the roads were open, the air would be bright and thin. I imagined the thinness, how it might scrape the lungs clean. I imagined standing at a railing and recognizing the scale of what I had ignored. When he came back in, he asked, almost an afterthought, if I ever missed the city. "Sometimes," I said. "Mostly what I miss is choosing." He nodded as if the sentence made more sense than it did. We sat in the living room, each on our own end of the sofa, the lamplight making a small island out of us. I fixed the throw pillow behind my back with deliberate slowness, the choreography of someone responsible for not inviting misunderstanding. He rested his hands on his knees and looked at the books on the shelf. "You kept the travel guides," he said. I told him we kept a lot of things we never used. The first thing that made me uneasy wasn't attraction. It was the ease. The way silence didn't demand filling. The way a stray joke landed without fanfare and made both of us exhale at the same time. This is the kind of detail that outsiders consider harmless. This is how a person like me walks toward a cliff without believing in cliffs. Later, I made up the guest room. I smoothed the sheets with the careful palms of someone undoing a crease in a marriage certificate. I placed a glass of water on the bedside table and stood there longer than necessary, listening to the quiet hum of the house. When I turned to go, he was standing in the doorway, apologizing for startling me, thanking me again for the towels. He said he'd be up early to run if the roads were dry. I said the roads here always look dry and then surprise you. He smiled at that, an unguarded smile, and the room tipped for a fraction of a second. I steadied myself with a hand on the chest of drawers and told my body to behave. In bed, I waited for my husband's key in the lock and fell asleep before it came. I dreamed of ridgelines, the kind that fold the world into deep pockets of blue, and of a wooden railing under my palms. In the dream, I wasn't alone at the railing, but when I turned, the figure beside me wasn't clear. I woke with the certainty I had done something irreversible simply by imagining. At breakfast the next day, our first morning all three under one roof, my husband kissed the air near my cheek and asked if the coffee was strong. He clapped his son on the shoulder and said it was good to have him home, the word home thrown like a blanket over a scene with too many chairs. We talked about the mountains again. The radio said the same thing it had said yesterday, like the weather was looping on purpose, giving us a chance to choose differently. My husband said we should go up there together, make a day of it. We'll clear our heads, he said. He looked at me as if I were a sensible pair of hiking boots. I said yes because yes is the oil that keeps our machine from squeaking. On the way to the sink, I brushed the back of my hand against the edge of the table. The sting was immediate and instructive, a reminder that the body notices even when the mind pretends not to. I rinsed the cups, lined them upside down on the rack, and watched their shadows cool on the counter. There is a sentence I didn't say then, a sentence I kept in my mouth like a seed. I want something I don't know how to want without hurting everyone. I swallowed it. I have always been good at swallowing what might grow. If you asked me where the first crack opened, I would point to no single touch, no single glance. I would point to the moment I understood that attention could be gentle, that it didn't have to arrive with fanfare or demand. I would point to the fact that my husband didn't notice the radio's forecast had repeated, and that someone else did. I would point to the way the house felt smaller and larger at once, as if walls could breathe. The day unrolled itself in predictable errands, laundry, a call to confirm the roof inspection, a text to my class about the time change. He moved through the rooms without crowding them, a guest who leaves air where he stands. When I passed the hallway mirror, I saw a woman straightening her collar and realized how long it had been since I cared about a collar. I tucked a strand of hair behind my ear and felt foolish for noticing my own hands. That evening, the mountains were a plan we said aloud. The road was open, the map simple. We drew a neat line with our fingers and told ourselves it was a drive, nothing more. I folded the map and slid it into the drawer, as if hiding a line could hide the way it made my pulse rise. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the dry smell of pine down from the ridges. Inside, the house held its breath. The morning began with the usual quiet choreography of the house, kettle steaming, plates placed in their familiar spots, the floor cool under my feet. I was up before either of them, staring out the window at a horizon where the mountains sat like a darker line drawn across the sky. I laid out 3 cups, letting the steam touch my face, and sliced bread with a precision that felt almost ceremonial. When they walked in, the temperature of the air seemed to shift. My husband asked about the fuel in the car. I said it was fine. He smiled at his son, declaring the day ours to plan, and I felt a brief, disorienting lift in my chest. We decided to stop by the market for snacks and water before heading out. My list was simple, but my handwriting looked strange to me, as though my hand had adopted someone else's style. In the car I slid into the passenger seat without thinking, while he drove and my husband sat in the back, busy with his phone. We talked about the route, the lookout point, the possibility of ice where the sun couldn't reach. I tried not to focus on his hands at the wheel. The radio spoke of clear skies above the pass, and when his glance brushed mine, it carried more weight than any sentence. At the market, I wandered down a different aisle than usual, telling myself it was faster. He reached past me for a bottle of water, suggesting we get more than one in case the trail was longer than we thought. My husband answered a call, mentioning he might need to step away for another meeting later. I said the mountain wouldn't mind waiting, hearing in my own voice a softness I hadn't planned. The clerk at checkout asked if we were heading up today. I said yes. She warned that the wind at the ridge would bite but that the view was worth it. Her choice of words stayed with me as we stepped into the parking lot. A narrow strip of cloud clung to a peak before letting go. He laughed lightly at a stubborn shopping cart, guiding it without struggle. There's a kind of competence that doesn't need to announce itself, and that kind is the most dangerous to me. It implies steadiness, the one thing I've always wanted from someone's attention. Back home, my husband took another call in the office. I unpacked the groceries in neat lines, water, fruit, crackers, and a chocolate bar slipped in without reason except the thought that sweetness could save a tiring walk. He came into the kitchen quietly, standing on the far side of the counter as if it marked a boundary we both knew was there. "Do you need help with the thermos?" he asked. I said I could manage, but he pressed the lid until it clicked and stepped back with his hands lifted in mock surrender. It made me smile before I could stop myself. I went to the hall closet for the day pack. The zipper caught, and I bent to free it. When I looked up, he was there, holding a strip of tape for the frayed pull. "Temporary," he said. I nodded, feeling the word in a way I didn't want to admit. I took a pair of gloves from the shelf and thanked him, too aware of how even small rescues can matter. The hallway between the closet and kitchen was narrow enough to make strangers pause, and we did. We both stepped aside at once, then again, and laughed under our breath. My husband's voice rose faintly from the office. A draft slid through, raising goosebumps on my arms. He noticed, his eyes dropping to where my sleeve didn't cover my skin. "It's colder than it looks," he said. "I'll grab a scarf," I answered, though there wasn't one nearby. A sudden slam of a car door outside made the floor tremble, and we both reached for the doorframe. Our hands landed almost on the same spot, and neither of us moved right away. The paint was worn at the edge, a reminder of how long this house has stood. I focused on that chipped corner, as if it could hold my attention steady. He exhaled softly, and the air between us thickened. We kissed. The fact itself was brief, but the echo of it expanded in every direction. He stepped back first. I stayed still, feeling my pulse flare and fade. From the office came the scrape of chair wheels, pulling me upright again. "We should go," I said, my voice too calm for what had just happened. He nodded and passed me with deliberate courtesy, the kind that lingers in moments you can't take back. In the bathroom mirror, I saw a face that could pass for untroubled if someone didn't know where to look. I let cold water run over my hands, counting backward from 10 the way I tell my students to before a balance pose. It worked well enough to bring me back to practical motions, packing the bag, checking bottle caps, folding the map. My husband emerged from his call, expression neutral, and asked if we were ready. I said yes, my voice steady enough to fool anyone willing to believe it. The drive began in a polite quiet. The town gave way to open road, then to trees standing thinner as we climbed. My husband read aloud from the trail map, stumbling over the name of a bird. We corrected him at the same time and laughed together, the moment small but oddly binding. At the lookout, the wind pushed through our coats, and we stood at the railing facing a distance that felt indifferent to our presence. My husband took a picture of us with the mountain behind, a clean arrangement of 3 figures and a backdrop of unbroken beauty. In the photo, nothing would be wrong. That's how most days look from outside. I kept my gloved hands in my sleeves, noting how he stood just far enough away to respect the space we had crossed in the corridor. The descent was quieter. The light shifted warmer as the road curved down. We stopped for gas and bought a paper bag of almonds. The cashier asked if the road was icy. "Only in the shadows," I answered, knowing it was true in more ways than one. Back home, I slid the map into the drawer, the sound of paper on wood sharper than it should have been. I told myself the important thing was what I chose to do next, then stood in the kitchen for a long moment, choosing nothing at all. The morning after our trip to the lookout carried a different sort of quiet. It wasn't the usual domestic calm but something more deliberate, like everyone in the house had agreed to handle the air gently. My husband busied himself with emails at the dining table, tapping out short replies while sipping coffee gone lukewarm. I moved through the kitchen in slow, measured steps, as if any abrupt motion might shake something loose. The light from the window caught the edge of the counter, drawing a bright line that divided the room into before and after. We had planned to visit friends that afternoon, a casual arrangement my husband seemed to remember only after his third cup of coffee. He announced it as though it were a decision made in the moment, but I knew it had been in the calendar for weeks. I agreed without hesitation, even though the thought of being enclosed in a car again, all three of us, made my pulse quicken for reasons I didn't want to acknowledge. Before we left, I gathered the small necessities, my bag, a scarf, a bottle of water, while my husband searched for the keys. He asked his son to drive, saying he could use a break from the wheel. The suggestion was accepted without comment, though I noticed the quick glance that passed between the two men. I sat in the passenger seat again, the choice automatic, and felt the faint vibration of the engine through my shoes as we pulled away from the curb. The road out of town curved between low hills, their winter grass pale and flattened by wind. My husband leaned back, scrolling through his phone, occasionally murmuring something about traffic reports or sports scores. I kept my eyes ahead, watching the ribbon of asphalt stretch and dip. Now and then, I felt his gaze on me from the driver's seat, not prolonged but enough to register like a change in temperature. We stopped briefly at a small roadside cafe. The place smelled of brewed coffee and wood polish, its windows fogged from the heat inside. My husband excused himself to take a call outside, leaving us at the table with 2 mugs between us. I wrapped my hands around mine, letting the warmth seep into my fingers. He asked quietly if I liked the mountains better than the city. I said they were different kinds of quiet, one heavy, one light. His nod was slow, as though weighing the answer. We didn't speak again until my husband returned, shaking the chill from his coat. Back in the car, the landscape shifted to more open fields, the horizon wide and low. I thought about the friends we were visiting, people I liked well enough but never felt entirely at ease with, as if they were always reading more into my words than I intended. My husband chatted about shared memories with them, recounting small events I had nearly forgotten. He seemed lighter in these recollections, and I let his voice fill the space between the three of us. When we arrived, the house smelled of rosemary and fresh bread. Our hosts welcomed us warmly, ushering us into a living room arranged around a low fire. Conversation moved easily for them. I contributed when it seemed natural, otherwise letting the rhythm pass over me. I noticed him across the room, leaning against the arm of a chair, listening more than speaking. Every so often our eyes met for a fraction too long, and I would turn my attention to the fire, watching the wood collapse inward on itself. Dinner was served in generous portions, the table crowded with dishes. My husband told a story from years ago that had everyone laughing, his voice carrying above the rest. I felt an odd detachment, as though I were watching the scene from a seat just outside the circle. He, too, seemed apart from it, his attention drifting toward the window where the reflection of the room blurred against the darkness outside. After dessert, our host suggested a short walk to see the lights strung along the main street. My husband agreed eagerly, already pulling on his coat. The air outside was cold enough to make conversation sparse. The lights were charming in their uneven way, some brighter than others, their wires visible in the glow. We moved as a group, yet I was aware of him just behind me, his footsteps matching mine without effort. At one point, the crowd on the narrow sidewalk forced us closer, his shoulder brushing my arm. It was nothing more than contact in passing, yet it carried a charge that lingered long after. Back at the house, coffee was poured again, and talk shifted to future plans. My husband discussed the possibility of another mountain trip, this time with an overnight stay. Our hosts were enthusiastic. I kept my expression neutral, the warmth of the cup in my hands a steadying anchor. Across the room, he avoided my gaze, focusing instead on the low flame in the fireplace. The drive home was quiet. My husband dozed lightly in the back seat, his breathing slow and even. The road stretched ahead in long, dark ribbons, the headlights cutting a narrow path. We didn't speak, but the silence was full, not empty. Each turn of the wheels felt like it was bringing us closer to something unnamed. I kept my eyes on the road, yet was aware of every small shift in his posture, every time his hands adjusted on the steering wheel. When we pulled into the driveway, my husband woke and thanked his son for driving. I unlocked the door, letting the familiar scent of home settle around us. My husband went straight to the bedroom, already speaking about the week ahead. I lingered in the kitchen, putting away the scarf and bottle of water as if they needed to be in order before I could follow. He passed through on his way to the guest room, pausing briefly at the doorway. His eyes met mine, steady but unreadable, before he moved on without a word. That night, lying in bed, I listened to the small noises of the house, pipes cooling, wind at the eaves, a door latch settling into place. Each sound felt sharper than usual, as though the walls themselves were taking note. I closed my eyes, but the image that rose behind them was not of the lights on the main street or the fire in our friend's home. It was of the moment in the narrow sidewalk crowd when his shoulder brushed mine, the unremarkable gesture that still refused to fade. The next day unfolded in a pattern that looked ordinary enough from the outside, but under its surface, there was a steady pull I couldn't ignore. My husband spent the morning in his office, door ajar just enough for me to hear the low murmur of his calls. The house was quiet except for the sound of laundry cycling in the machine and the occasional creak from the hallway. I moved through my chores deliberately, keeping my hands busy to keep my mind from circling back to what had already happened, and to what I knew was waiting in the edges of my awareness. By late morning, he appeared in the kitchen, a folded list in hand. He said he was heading into town to pick up a few things, asked if I needed anything. My instinct was to say no, to keep the distance we had promised ourselves without ever actually saying the words, but instead I mentioned that I'd been meaning to visit the weekend market. My husband rarely went, and it seemed harmless enough. When I heard the office door shut again, I grabbed my coat and scarf, joining him at the front door before he could leave. The air outside had the sharp clarity of a cold day, the kind that makes colors more defined. We walked to his car without speaking, the crunch of gravel underfoot filling the space between us. Inside, the heater coughed to life and the windows slowly cleared. The streets were busy enough to require his attention, which gave me the excuse to watch the passing storefronts instead of looking at him. Even so, I could feel the subtle weight of his presence in the confined space of the car. At the market, the crowd moved in slow waves around the stalls, people bundled in thick coats, their breath clouding in the air. I stopped at a stand selling fresh bread, accepting a paper bag still warm from the oven. He lingered nearby, hands in his pockets, scanning the crowd as if to memorize the scene. At another stall, he picked up a jar of honey, holding it up for me to see. I nodded, adding it to my small collection of purchases. The movements were simple, but the awareness between us made them feel sharper, more deliberate. Near the far end of the market, a vendor was selling handmade scarves. The colors were muted, earth tones and soft grays, the kind I usually chose. I reached for one, feeling the texture between my fingers. He stepped closer to look at another, and for a moment our shoulders touched. It was the briefest contact, but it pulled my attention so completely that I almost forgot to answer the vendor's question about the price. I bought the scarf, tucking it into the bag as though it might conceal more than just fabric. We left the market with enough distance between us to appear casual. Back at the car, he loaded the bags into the trunk while I settled into my seat. The drive home was quiet except for the sound of the tires on the road. I thought about how easy it would be to convince myself that this was nothing more than two people running errands, but the thought didn't hold. There was too much in the silence, too much in the way he reached for the radio dial and then let his hand drop without turning it on. When we got home, my husband was still on the phone. I carried the bags into the kitchen, placing each item on the counter. He followed, setting the bread and honey down carefully. We exchanged a brief glance, one of those fleeting acknowledgments that are gone before they can be read. Then he left for the guest room, and I stood there, my hands resting on the counter, wondering how something so quiet could carry so much weight. That evening, my husband suggested we all go for a walk after dinner. The sky was already dimming, and the streetlights had begun to hum. We followed the familiar loop through the neighborhood, the three of us moving at an easy pace. He and my husband walked ahead for part of the route, talking about some minor repair that needed doing. I trailed a few steps behind, watching the way their shadows stretched and merged on the pavement. Later, when we shifted positions, he fell into step beside me. We didn't speak, but I was aware of the rhythm of our strides, the way they matched without effort. Back at the house, the evening settled into its usual shapes, television in the background, the sound of dishes in the sink, lights dimmed in the hallway. My husband eventually excused himself to his office again. I was left in the living room with a book I didn't read, turning pages without absorbing the words. He passed through on his way upstairs, pausing just long enough to ask if I needed anything before bed. I shook my head, and he continued without waiting for more. When I finally went to my room, the house had that particular stillness it gets late at night, every sound amplified. I lay in the dark, thinking about the day, the market, the scarf, the unspoken awareness threaded through each moment. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't even visible from the outside, but it was there, growing in the quiet, in the spaces no one else could see. The next day arrived with the muted light of a sky holding back weather. Clouds pressed low, making the air feel heavier, as if the house itself was leaning inward. My husband had already left for an early meeting, his absence marked by the quiet order he preferred, folded newspaper, empty coffee cup in the sink, chair pushed in neatly under the table. I moved through the morning without hurry, making tea instead of coffee, lingering by the window longer than necessary. The street outside looked washed of color, the kind of day where people stayed indoors unless they had a reason not to. He appeared in the kitchen just before midday, wearing the same dark sweater he'd worn the day we went to the lookout. He asked if I had plans for the afternoon, his tone casual, the way one might ask about the weather. I told him I didn't, though I added something about laundry, as if that detail might make the answer sound more ordinary. He mentioned the fireplace in the living room, how it hadn't been lit in a while, and suggested it might be a good day for it. I agreed, and the conversation ended there, but the decision was set. I spent the early afternoon folding clothes in the bedroom, the rhythmic work giving my hands something to do while my thoughts drifted. The sound of wood being stacked in the hearth carried faintly down the hallway. When I brought the folded laundry to the guest room, he was crouched by the fireplace, arranging kindling. The sharp scent of wood mixed with the faint chill of air from the open flue. I set the clothes on the bed and stood for a moment, watching the deliberate movements of his hands as he worked. The fire caught slowly, then with more confidence, crackling in a way that filled the room without overpowering it. He moved to the opposite end of the sofa, leaving space between us but not so much that the warmth of the fire felt impersonal. I sat with a book, though I knew I wouldn't read more than a few lines at a time. The light from the fire flickered across the walls, casting moving shadows that shifted with every snap of the wood. We spoke about small things, how quickly the seasons seemed to change here, the kind of winter storms the mountains could bring, whether the local market would still have fresh produce once the frost set in. It was conversation without weight, but not without meaning. The pauses between our sentences stretched just enough to feel deliberate, each one holding something unspoken. At one point, I reached for my tea on the side table, and he leaned slightly to hand it to me before I could take it myself. Our fingers didn't touch, but the closeness was enough to leave a trace of awareness behind. I thanked him, my voice quieter than I intended. The fire popped, sending a small ember against the screen, and we both turned toward the sound at the same time. Our eyes met, and for a moment neither of us looked away. The rhythm of the afternoon shifted then, as if the air in the room had thickened. He asked if I remembered the view from the lookout, the way the horizon seemed endless. I said I did, and that I'd thought about it more than once since we'd been there. He didn't answer right away, instead adjusting the log in the fire with the metal poker, the motion slow and steady. We kissed. It was slower than the first time, deliberate in a way that made the silence afterward feel heavier. When we pulled back, I set my tea down, not because I was finished with it, but because I didn't trust my hand to hold it steady. He leaned back against the sofa, his gaze on the fire, while I tried to decide if standing up would make things better or worse. The sound of the front door opening made the decision for us. My husband's voice carried from the entryway, calling out that the meeting had ended early. I rose, smoothing my sweater, and walked toward the hallway with the calmest expression I could manage. He followed a moment later, moving toward the kitchen as if nothing in the last hour had happened. My husband set his briefcase down, asking about lunch, about whether the heat from the fire was enough for the whole room. I answered evenly, my voice finding the right balance between warmth and distance. He stepped into the living room, complimenting the fire, and I excused myself to put the kettle on. From the kitchen, I could hear their voices blending into an easy conversation about the best type of wood for burning, a topic with no stakes and no consequence. When we all sat together later, tea in hand, the afternoon looked almost the same as it might have on any other day. The fire burned steadily, the cups steamed, and the wind outside had picked up enough to rattle the bare branches against the windows. My husband spoke about the coming weekend, suggesting we might visit the mountains again before the snow made the roads unpredictable. I nodded at the right moments, my gaze fixed on the slow collapse of one of the logs into glowing coals. By the time the light outside began to fade, the house had returned to its usual rhythm. My husband retreated to his office for a call, leaving the two of us in the living room once more. We didn't speak this time, only shared the quiet, the occasional shift of the fire filling the space between us. Eventually, he stood, saying he'd turn in early, and I watched him leave without comment. When I was alone, I sat for a while longer, letting the fire burn down to embers. The room smelled faintly of smoke and pine, a scent that would linger in the fabric of the sofa for days. I gathered the empty cups, carried them to the kitchen, and washed them slowly, the sound of water in the sink steady and unhurried. Upstairs, I could hear the faint creak of floorboards as doors closed for the night. Lying in bed later, I thought about the kiss, not the act itself, but the quiet that followed it. It wasn't the kind of silence that erased what had happened, it was the kind that preserved it, holding it in place like a photograph in an unseen frame. I closed my eyes, knowing that tomorrow would come with its own shape, its own decisions, but tonight, the memory sat just beneath the surface, steady and unshifting. The next morning carried the brittle chill that usually comes just before a storm. The windows had fogged at the edges, blurring the bare trees outside. My husband sat at the dining table, flipping through a newspaper with more interest than the articles deserved. He mentioned casually that we should still go ahead with the mountain trip today before the weather turned, as the cabin was already booked. I nodded, hiding the quicken pace of my thoughts, and went to make tea. He left the table to pack the car while I moved through the familiar motions of gathering gloves, scarves, and the insulated bag for food. In the kitchen, I checked the thermos twice, though it was already filled. When I stepped outside, the air held that faint metallic scent that comes before snow. The car idled in the driveway, exhaust curling into the air like pale ribbons. He loaded the last of the bags, his movements efficient, while my husband locked the front door. The drive began in near silence. The heater hummed, the tires hummed louder on the cold road. My husband sat in the back seat, leaning forward occasionally to point out where the frost clung to shaded patches of grass. He spoke about a project he needed to finish next week, his voice a steady background to the sound of the wind. I kept my eyes on the narrow ribbon of road ahead, though my awareness of the driver's presence never faded. The landscape changed as we climbed, fields giving way to dense stands of pine. The air thinned enough that I felt it when I spoke, so I spoke less. We stopped briefly at a small store along the way for extra supplies, bread, fruit, a small jar of jam. My husband took longer inside than expected, chatting with the shopkeeper about road conditions. When we returned to the car, he was still reading the receipt, shaking his head at a minor overcharge. By the time we reached the cabin, the light had shifted toward afternoon. The building stood low and solid against the slope, smoke already curling from the chimney as if welcoming us. Inside, the air was warm but carried a faint draft from somewhere in the boards. My husband inspected the fireplace and checked the kitchen cupboards, muttering about whether we had enough kindling. Not long after we settled in, his phone rang. He stepped into the main room to answer, pacing as he spoke. His tone shifted to the clipped rhythm he used for work calls, and within minutes, his expression tightened. He covered the mouthpiece to tell us there was a situation back in town, something he couldn't leave until tomorrow. He hesitated only briefly before deciding he would drive down now, leaving us to enjoy the cabin. He said he'd return by midday tomorrow, if the roads stayed clear. We both offered to come with him, though my voice lacked real insistence. He waved the idea away, saying it was unnecessary. In less than 20 minutes, his bag was packed, his coat zipped, his boots laced. The sound of the car pulling away was brief, muffled almost instantly by the trees. Then the silence arrived, not the kind filled with wind or creaking boards, but the deeper kind that settles when a house is holding its breath. We moved through the first hour as though nothing had changed. He stacked a few logs by the fireplace. I put the groceries in the small fridge. We spoke about making tea, about whether the weather would hold, each exchange brief and almost formal. Outside, the wind moved through the trees with a steady, low sound, like water running far away. As dusk began to press in, the cabin seemed to shrink around the glow of the fire. The air near the windows cooled quickly, and I drew my chair closer to the hearth. He brought 2 cups of tea to the table without being asked, setting mine down with quiet precision. The logs in the fireplace shifted, sending up a scatter of sparks. We both watched them rise and disappear. The conversation turned to the view from the ridge we'd seen on our last trip. He asked if I remembered the narrow trail that wound along the cliff. I said I did, and that the memory of the cold air there stayed with me more than the view itself. He nodded, eyes resting on the firelight rather than on me. The evening moved in measured steps. We finished the tea, replaced it with water, and spoke less as the hours passed. Now and then, the wind pushed hard enough against the cabin to make the beams groan. I felt each sound as if it were inside my chest. The space between us wasn't measured in feet but in the way every movement was noticed. Later, when the last log in the fireplace burned low, he suggested adding another to keep the room warm through the night. I stood to fetch one from the stack by the door. When I turned, he was closer than I'd expected, the firelight catching in the dark fabric of his sweater. The warmth in the air felt heavier than the heat alone could explain. We spent the night together. Afterward, the silence returned, but it was a different silence than before, denser, weighted with something that couldn't be pushed aside. Outside, the wind had dropped, leaving only the faint creak of the cabin settling. I sat for a while, staring at the slow collapse of the logs into ash, before finally rising to prepare for sleep. In the small bedroom, the air was cooler. I lay in the dark listening for any sound from the other room, but the cabin was still. My mind tried to fix on the practical, what time my husband might arrive tomorrow, whether the road would be icy, but those thoughts dissolved quickly. The night stretched on, holding everything that had just happened in its quiet center, untouched by the passing hours. 7. The morning light in the cabin was thin and colorless, pressing through the curtains in narrow strips. The fire had burned down to gray ash, the air cooler than I expected. I lay still for a while, listening for the sounds of movement from the other room. None came. When I finally rose, the wooden floor was cold under my feet, and the boards creaked in a way that reminded me how far we were from anything familiar. In the kitchen, the faint smell of last night's fire lingered. He was at the small table, already dressed, a mug of coffee in his hands. He looked up briefly, offering a quiet morning, then returned his gaze to the window. I made tea in silence, the kettle's hiss filling the room with something that wasn't quite comfort. Outside, the trees moved gently in the early wind, and a pale fog lingered between their trunks. We spoke little as we prepared to leave. He gathered the few things we'd used, the cups, the plates, the folded blankets from the sofa, and I packed the food into the insulated bag. There was no rush, but we moved as if there was. By the time the sun had cleared the tops of the trees, the cabin was back in order, every sign of our stay tucked away. The drive down the mountain was steady and quiet. The road curved in long sweeps, each turn revealing another stretch of frost-covered ground. The silence between us wasn't awkward, but it wasn't empty either. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, watching for the patches of ice the shopkeeper had warned about. He kept both hands on the wheel, his attention outward, though I caught him glancing toward me once when we slowed for a sharp bend. We reached the base of the mountain sooner than I expected. The air was warmer here, the fog gone. I checked my phone for the first time since we'd left the cabin, finding a message from my husband saying he'd be home by late afternoon instead of midday. I didn't mention it aloud, and he didn't ask. We stopped briefly at a roadside cafe for coffee and bread, sitting at a table by the window. The view was unremarkable, just a narrow strip of parking lot and a stretch of road, but it gave us something else to look at. When we reached the house, the driveway was empty. The front door creaked the way it always did, and the familiar scent of the place wrapped around us. He carried the bags inside, setting them on the kitchen counter. I unpacked the food automatically, arranging it in the pantry, then placed the folded scarf I'd worn back onto the hook in the hallway. He lingered for a moment, leaning on the counter, then excused himself to the guest room. The rest of the afternoon passed in separate spaces. I did laundry, moving between rooms with measured steps. The sound of the washing machine filled the hallway, and the faint scent of detergent clung to the air. Once, I passed by the guest room door and heard the muffled sound of music playing softly, though I didn't pause to listen. By the time my husband's car pulled into the driveway, the house looked unchanged, as if the last 24 hours had been absorbed into its walls. He entered with his usual briskness, setting his bag down and asking how the cabin had been. I gave short answers, mentioning the fire, the cold mornings, the quiet. He seemed satisfied, moving on to talk about the meeting that had kept him away. Dinner was simple with soupy bread, a salad, and the three of us sat together at the table. Conversation drifted between topics, work schedules, the possibility of snow later in the week, a neighbor's new fence. I kept my tone even, my gaze shifting naturally between the two of them. Across the table, he joined in when prompted, his words measured and steady. Nothing in his expression betrayed the hours in the cabin. After dinner, my husband suggested watching something on television. We settled into the living room, the glow of the screen washing over us. I sat at one end of the sofa, my husband in the middle, and he in the armchair across from us. The program's dialogue filled the space, but I caught moments where his attention seemed elsewhere, his gaze fixed not on the screen but on some point just beyond it. When the show ended, my husband went to make a phone call in his office. The house felt quiet except for the faint hum of the heating system. I stood to gather the empty cups, and he rose at the same time. We crossed paths in the narrow space between the coffee table and the sofa. There was enough room for us both to pass without touching, but I felt the air shift as we moved. In the kitchen, I washed the cups slowly, the warm water clouding with soap. He set his on the counter beside me, a brief glance passing between us before he stepped back. The moment held nothing visible, yet I felt it settle somewhere inside, unspoken but solid. Later, when the house was quiet again, I sat in the bedroom with the light off, watching the outline of the curtains move slightly with the draft. The day had been ordinary in every way that could be measured, and yet it carried the weight of something that couldn't be recorded. The cabin, the road, the silence, they were all behind us now, folded into the fabric of days that would look unremarkable to anyone else. I lay down, listening to the distant murmur of my husband's voice in the other room, and to the softer, almost inaudible sound of a door closing down the hall. The house settled for the night, and I let my eyes close, knowing that some things, once set in motion, can't be returned to where they began. The next morning began with a pale light leaking through the curtains, a light too thin to warm the room. My husband had already left for the office, his departure marked only by the faint scent of his cologne in the hallway and the newspaper folded neatly on the kitchen table. I stood by the sink with a cup of tea, letting the steam rise toward my face while I looked out at the frost clinging to the grass. The quiet felt deeper than usual, though the house was no more or less empty than it had been on any other weekday morning. He came into the kitchen not long after, his steps measured, as though careful not to intrude. We exchanged brief greetings, and he reached into the cupboard for a mug without asking if there was more tea. I offered to warm the kettle again, and he nodded, settling into the chair across from me. The sound of the water heating filled the space between us. Neither of us seemed to be searching for conversation, it was enough to share the room in silence. When the tea was ready, we lingered over it rather than starting our separate routines. Outside, a thin mist began to lift from the yard, revealing the uneven lines of the garden fence. He mentioned it might be a good day to fix one of the loose panels before the weather turned worse. I agreed in principle but said it was probably best left until the weekend. The exchange was simple, but I felt the weight of his eyes on me a moment longer than the words required. By mid-morning, I moved into the living room to sort through a stack of papers I'd been avoiding. The rustle of pages and the scratch of a pen filled the air. Somewhere in the background, I could hear the faint sound of music from his phone, though the melody was too quiet to place. At one point, he passed through the room on his way outside, mentioning something about clearing the path by the side of the house. I nodded without looking up, the motion of my pen steady even as my thoughts drifted toward the sound of the door closing behind him. When he returned, there was a faint trace of cold air around him. He set his gloves on the counter and poured himself more tea. I gathered the papers into a neat stack and joined him, the two of us standing at opposite ends of the kitchen island. He asked how the work was going. I answered honestly that it was tedious but necessary. His smile was brief, almost distracted, before he reached for his gloves again and left them on the windowsill to dry. In the afternoon, my husband called to say he would be home later than expected. The reason was work, as usual, and his tone was casual, as if this were an ordinary adjustment to the day. I hung up and relayed the message without much thought, but I caught the flicker of acknowledgement in his expression. It wasn't a smile, more a small tightening around the eyes, the kind of look that holds both awareness and restraint. The hours that followed moved slowly. I folded laundry in the bedroom, the soft thud of fabric stacking on the bed a steady rhythm. Down the hall, I could hear him moving occasionally, the creak of floorboards and the faint sound of a door closing. By late afternoon, the light had begun to fade, and the house felt wrapped in a muted stillness. I started preparing dinner earlier than usual, partly to fill the space and partly because the act of cooking gave me something to focus on. He came into the kitchen while I was chopping vegetables, offering to help. I shook my head but asked if he could bring in more wood for the fire. He returned a few minutes later with an armful, placing it carefully by the hearth. The scent of the cold outdoors clung to his clothes, mixing with the warmth of the room. When the fire caught, its light flickered against the walls, turning the edges of the furniture into soft shapes. I stirred the pot on the stove, aware of the quiet behind me. He had taken a seat near the fireplace, leaning back with his hands resting loosely on his knees. The only sounds were the pop of the wood and the slow simmer of the food. It was a scene without incident, yet it carried an undercurrent I couldn't name without breaking it. We ate when the meal was ready, the table set simply. Conversation touched on practical things, weather, errands, small details of the week ahead. Each sentence was short, but the silences between them felt deliberate rather than empty. The rhythm of the evening was steady, almost careful, as if we were both aware of the boundaries without needing to discuss them. After the dishes were washed and put away, I sat in the living room with a book, though I turned more pages than I read. He passed through once, on his way to the guest room, and paused to ask if I needed anything before bed. I said no, my voice even, and he continued down the hall. The faint sound of his door closing reached me a few moments later. Later that night, the house was quiet except for the occasional hum of the heating system. I stood by the window for a while, looking out at the yard. The frost had returned, glittering faintly in the weak light from the street lamp. It was an ordinary scene, but it held the kind of stillness that makes every sound feel sharper. When I finally went to bed, I lay awake for some time, listening to the familiar creaks of the house settling. There was no rush of thoughts, no tangled chain of what-ifs, only a steady awareness of the day that had passed and the way it had been shaped by both what was said and what wasn't. The quiet seemed to stretch in every direction, and I let it, knowing that tomorrow would bring its own pattern, equally familiar and equally changed. The following day began without urgency. A faint layer of frost still clung to the grass when I opened the curtains, and the air in the room carried the cool stillness of early winter mornings. My husband left soon after breakfast, mentioning an errand in town and a meeting he might attend if the timing worked. His departure felt routine, yet I noticed how the silence shifted the moment the door closed behind him. The house was calm in a way that made every sound distinct. The ticking of the clock in the hallway, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the soft rustle of pages when I opened the book I'd left on the arm of the chair. He appeared in the living room a short while later, offering a polite nod before settling into the opposite chair. We didn't exchange more than a few words at first, but the absence of conversation wasn't uncomfortable. By mid-morning, I decided to tackle the closet in the hallway, which had been neglected for too long. Coats hung unevenly, scarves tangled in a pile on the shelf. He passed by and stopped at the doorway, asking if I wanted help. I agreed, and together we began pulling things out, sorting them into piles: keep, donate, repair. The task was practical, but working side by side in the narrow space made the air feel denser somehow. At one point, a box on the top shelf tipped as he reached for it, and a small envelope slid to the floor. I bent to pick it up, brushing the dust from its surface. Inside was a pair of old lift tickets from a ski trip years ago, the dates faintly visible. I held them for a moment before placing them on the shelf. He glanced at them briefly, then returned to arranging the coats. The moment passed without comment, yet it stayed with me as we continued working. When the closet was finished, we carried the donation pile to the car. The cold air outside was sharp enough to catch in the lungs, and I was glad to return indoors. I made tea while he checked the firewood stack, calling into the kitchen that it would last another week if the weather stayed mild. We sat at the table with our cups, speaking about small matters, the forecast, the likelihood of snow before the holidays, whether the market would still have fresh apples this late in the season. In the early afternoon, I went upstairs to put away laundry. The house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that lets you hear distant sounds clearly. From the hallway, I caught the faint noise of the front door opening and closing. A few minutes later, he appeared in the kitchen with a paper bag from the bakery. He placed it on the counter without ceremony, saying he thought fresh bread might be better than what we had left. I thanked him, slicing into it while the crust was still warm. The rest of the day moved at an even pace. I worked on some paperwork at the dining table, while he alternated between the guest room and small tasks around the house. Now and then, our paths crossed in ways that felt both ordinary and deliberate. In the late afternoon, the sky darkened earlier than usual, the clouds heavy with the threat of rain. Not long before my husband was due home, I went to the front hall to hang up my scarf. As I slipped it onto the hook, my fingers brushed against something in the pocket of my coat. I pulled it out without thinking, a folded ticket stub from the mountain lift. The paper was slightly creased, the date visible in the corner. I stood there for a moment, my hand still half in the pocket, before tucking it away again. When my husband returned, he seemed in good spirits. He set his keys on the table and asked about the day. I told him it had been quiet, that we'd sorted the hallway closet and taken some things to donate. He nodded approvingly, moving on to talk about his meeting. I kept my responses measured, aware of how easily a conversation could turn toward things I didn't want to explain. Dinner was simple: roasted vegetables, bread, and a pot of soup. The three of us sat at the table, the conversation light and without weight. My husband asked if the lift tickets I'd found in the closet were from the trip years ago, his voice casual. I glanced at him, surprised, before remembering I'd left them on the shelf earlier. I said yes, that they must have been misplaced all this time. He accepted the answer without hesitation, turning the conversation toward plans for the weekend. After dinner, the evening settled into its usual rhythm. My husband went to his office to finish some work, leaving me in the living room with a blanket and a book. The fire burned low, the room warm enough that I could have closed my eyes and drifted off. He passed through quietly, pausing for just a moment before continuing down the hall. Later, when I went upstairs, the house was nearly silent. In the bedroom, I stood by the window for a while, looking out at the faint shimmer of rain beginning to fall. The sound was soft but steady, a backdrop that made the house feel even more enclosed. I thought about the ticket stub still in my coat pocket and the way my husband had accepted the explanation without question. I turned off the light and lay down, listening to the rain and the occasional creak of the floorboards. There was nothing remarkable in the day that could be pointed to, nothing anyone else would see as out of place. Yet the weight of it stayed with me, quiet and unshifting, like a shadow that never changes shape no matter how the light moves. The morning broke with a pale, cold light that made every surface in the house appear sharper, as though the air had been scrubbed clean overnight. I moved quietly through the kitchen, setting the kettle on and slicing bread, the sound of the knife against the cutting board the only noise. My husband sat at the table, absorbed in the news on his tablet, his coffee cooling beside him. Across the room, the chair he usually occupied when working from home was empty, and I knew he was still upstairs. We followed a routine that felt rehearsed: breakfast, small talk, my husband mentioning a list of errands he would tackle before lunch. His tone was even, but I sensed the deliberate structure of his day, as if he had already mapped it out to the minute. I cleared the plates and rinsed them while he gathered his things. When he left, the sound of the door closing echoed more than it should have, a reminder of how the house changes the moment it loses one of its occupants. I spent the next hour tidying small corners that didn't require attention but kept my hands occupied. Upstairs, the creak of floorboards marked his movement from one room to another. Eventually he came down, carrying a book he set on the table without comment. We exchanged a few words about the weather, the possibility of rain later in the day, and then settled into a silence that was neither strained nor casual, just a space we both seemed content to leave undisturbed. By late morning, I decided to take a short walk to the corner store for milk. He offered to come along, and I agreed without thinking. Outside, the air was crisp, the ground damp from a light overnight drizzle. We walked without hurry, passing the same houses we always did, the routine path feeling different for reasons I didn't name. At the store, I picked up the milk and a loaf of bread while he waited near the entrance, scanning the shelves with the disinterested ease of someone who wasn't really shopping. On the way back, our conversation touched briefly on the weekend plans. My husband had mentioned dinner with neighbors, possibly another visit to the mountains before the roads iced over. I answered simply, careful not to let my tone carry more than agreement. When we reached the house, I put the groceries away while he retreated to the living room, taking up a seat by the window. The afternoon unfolded quietly. My husband returned earlier than I expected, his energy noticeably brighter than in recent days. He spoke at length about the errands, the people he'd run into, the efficiency of getting everything done ahead of schedule. I listened, keeping my responses measured, and noted how easily the day seemed to slide into its familiar shape when he was in the room. It was during dinner that the first shift came. The conversation was light, touching on work and the weather, when my husband suddenly mentioned finding a ticket stub while looking for something in the hallway. He said it almost absently, but his gaze lingered on me just long enough for the question to land. I felt the moment stretch, my fork paused above the plate, before I said it must have been from an old trip years ago. He nodded slowly, the expression on his face unreadable, and turned the topic elsewhere. After the meal, my husband moved to the living room to watch television. I cleared the table, rinsing dishes under the steady rush of warm water. He passed through behind me on his way to the guest room, his steps quiet but deliberate. The moment was brief, yet I felt its weight long after he'd gone. Later in the evening, my husband excused himself for a phone call, leaving me in the kitchen with only the hum of the refrigerator for company. I sat for a while at the table, the light overhead casting a pale circle on the wood, before standing to pour myself a glass of water. As I set the glass down, I noticed the faint sound of the guest room door closing. When my husband returned, he seemed preoccupied, his mind still on whatever conversation he'd just had. We spoke a little more about the weekend, then decided to turn in early. I climbed the stairs ahead of him, pausing briefly at the top to listen to the faint sounds of the house settling, pipes cooling, the wind brushing against the windows, a floorboard shifting under weight somewhere in the distance. In bed, I stared at the ceiling, the pale rectangle of moonlight on the wall shifting as the night wore on. The day had ended without any visible disruption, yet it carried an edge I couldn't ignore, a quiet question left hanging in the space between conversations. I closed my eyes, knowing there was nothing in my words that could be pointed to, nothing in my actions that could be named outright. And yet, the sense of something held just beneath the surface remained, steady and unchanged, as the house slipped into its familiar silence.